share some early degrees when due outcomes from Missouri. These are very early, and open it up for a Q&A, and I'm here to really answer a lot of your questions. Okay, if I can get my slides working. So this is a slide that I've used before. I know that I've seen this in some of your reports in Missouri as well, but I think it's an excellent slide to set the context of who we're talking about when we're talking about our students today. I think it's incredibly important that we are able to consider all of the multiple hats that our students wear, all of the multiple roles that they exist in. We know that a lot of our students might not be coming directly from high school. Some of them have already attended college, and many of them, most of them, have unique needs. So whatever programs that we end up designing for our students need to be intentional for our communities and for the students that we want to attract. On this slide, you can see some stats that were from the Lumina Foundation's Today's Students Report in 2019. 64% of college students work, 40% full-time, 6% serve or have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, 49% are financially independent from their parents, and well over half, 57%, live independently, so away from their parents or student housing, and then 24% of college students have children or other dependents. And as all of us have been working through this, the pandemic over the last year or year and a half, I think if you imagine what's happened in our own lives, and those of us who we've been struggling and wearing multiple hats and working at home, many parenting and teaching their children from home, can recognize that the pandemic has only magnified the importance of paying attention to this. So normally I would talk about this college no degree population, but I think we're all pretty familiar with those figures. There were over 36 million students with some college no degree. Around 4 million of those are estimated to be near completers, so within reach of completing a degree or credential. And I know that there are around 75,000 near completers in Missouri. But I wanted to also share this slide today, and I apologize, the bottom looks like it got cut off a little bit. This is from a National Student Clearinghouse report that was just released today. And this report was on the change in enrollment, including spring 2021 enrollment. And I think it's, again, just startling for us to recognize and to see this and to really think about the importance of our work in the years ahead. If you were to look, enrollment was down in spring 2021, which is the far right. Enrollment was down 3.5%, and two-year institutions in particular, down 9.5%. And in public 4 years, down 0.6%. So if you're curious about this, I recommend that you definitely look for the report on that NSC released. I think it was just today. And they do give some estimates, state that are disaggregated by state. So you can take a look at Missouri and what the kind of enrollment estimates are and the percent change over the previous years. But, what I'm here to do is talk about, one of the ways that we've been working to address this student population, and that's through our initiative that's housed at IHEP called Degrees When Due. And Degrees When Due is a national initiative to increase degree attainment among the population of students with some college no degree. You've probably heard about it. Like I said, Missouri has been partnering with us for a couple of years. And this was really based on our evidence-based best practices that we learned from Project Win-Win and from Credit When It's Due. So far, we're in our third and final year of implementation in this phase, and we've had almost 200 participating institutions from 23 different states and systems. 59 of those have been minority serving institutions. 2 of those come from Missouri. This is just a graphic to show the national scope and who's been engaged with this effort over the last few years. In Missouri in particular, we had a really we were really excited by the overwhelming response and interest in participating in this work. So this is a list of the 2-year institutions and the 4-year institutions that were the initial group who signed up to work with us. Due to kind of enrollment challenges, financial impacts, and staffing reductions that had to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, we did have 8 institutions that are unable to continue with us right now. Either a couple suffered cybersecurity breaches, and then there were some that were really dealing with staffing reductions. But I think it's important to honor all those that originally kind of signed up to do this work. We're, again, interested, I put the 2 HBCUs that are working on this in bold, and I'll talk about that why in a few minutes. And then one that we're also really excited about, if you can see the asterisks next to Lincoln University, they're one of our research sites for Degrees When Due. This means that they've agreed to share student level data with our research team. And we're really able to dig in and answer some questions as to how students move through the degree reclamation process, and really conduct focus groups and interviews at the institution and with students. We're going to be publishing a case study later in the year that's just focused on Lincoln University and their experience with this initiative. And all of the work of these institutions will be included in our final report that's released early next year. But I think being a research site is a great opportunity, and we're thrilled to be able to learn from Lincoln and to be able to highlight their stories and to talk about how this type of work has made a difference for their students and in helping to build institutional capacity. Because I know not everyone might be familiar with Degrees When Due, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the initiative and how this program works. So we help institutions implement proven reverse transfer and adult re-engagement strategies that are going to help students with some college, no degree, earn and complete a degree or credential. We provide technical assistance and support through an online learning management system. This has built-in work plans, resources, and toolkits, and really provides the step-by-step implementation directions. Each campus is also paired, or each state is paired with a coach, and that coach is able to work kind of at the state or system level, but also with individual campuses. And I think we're incredibly lucky that we have an excellent coach for institutions in the state of Missouri, someone who's spent his career as a registrar at a college in Michigan and really understands the kind of technical in the weeds ins and outs of data mining and degree auditing and how to be more efficient with those practices. Through Degrees When Due, we also support capacity building and we help guide institutions through the process of how they institutionalize this work. We also work with institutions to leverage their real-time student data and to examine existing policies and procedures so that they can make a case for policy change and reform. And then lastly, if you looked at that slide a couple of slides ago, we connect institutions with the national community of practice and the state and campus leaders who are committed to supporting students with some college, no degree. Here are our overall goals for the initiative. And, we had a big disruption due to COVID. And if you were to look at the white paper that was just published that Sarah authored, you can notice that within that white paper as well. But we did have to pause implementation as we kind of let all of our institutions reassess what was happening on their campus and figure out what they needed to do to best serve their students in the moment. And then we regrouped in fall of 2020 to refocus on identifying and re-engaging students. So we're not really going to be able to share all of our outcomes until early 2022, but overall big picture goals kind of fit into these three buckets. Increased post-secondary attainment. So again, helping more students complete college credentials, post-secondary credentials. Equitable post-secondary attainment. So how do we work with institutions to identify where certain groups of students might be falling behind or stopping out more than other groups? And how can we use that data to create more equitable pathways and to re-engage those specific groups of students so that we can ultimately help close equity gaps in post-secondary attainment? I'm speaking about this really broadly because I think we work across the US and every state has slightly different populations and what they would consider kind of their equity populations of students. And then institutional capacity change. And this is kind of the non-sexy stuff because we don't have exciting stats always to share about this, but this work is hard. It takes a lot of time. But if you're committed to it, we've really seen institutions be able to rethink their campus completion culture, rewrite some policies and the way that they work and serve students. Ultimately, these changes are going to help stem students from stopping out in the first place. So how do we do all of this? I think it's critical that we keep two principles in mind. The first is to know your data, and the second is keep equity at the center. Disaggregated data is critical to promote attainment for all students. And institutions need to be able to access their disaggregated data to identify all barriers to completion, particularly for students who come from populations and pathways that have been historically underserved or marginalized in higher education. And then once you are able to do that, you can use your disaggregated data to promote equity in your re-engagement and completion efforts. We also know that there are a multitude of reasons why students don't finish their degrees. We know that first generation, low income, and Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are disproportionately impacted. So understanding their data, their enrollment patterns, and their needs can help you identify ways to really meet your students where they are. And then I'd like to talk about equity for a moment. And I love this image from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to just illustrate what we mean when we talk about equity. Equality is sameness, while equity is fairness. So in equality, you see that everyone is getting the same bike, regardless of their individual needs. But in the lower image, folks are given bicycles that are fundamentally designed to get them in their own unique situation from point A to point B, so that they are all each able to ride their own bike. That's the point about equity. You redesign or restructure what you're doing in order to meet individual needs. And so we work with our institutions to consider equity in policy decisions and key equity questions. So once they've started to look at their data, they can understand, do different populations or different requirements yield significantly different results for different populations? Or is there a specific policy or process requirement that is disproportionately affecting the composition of students that you might even be identifying for outreach in your some college no degree population? So now I'll talk a little bit about how we work with institutions to use their data. And I think these are some principles that you can keep in mind whether or not you are kind of involved with degrees when doing these efforts. So first, we ask our institutions to use their disaggregated data to determine where specific populations are leaving the educational pipeline. Through Degrees When Due, institutions are looking at 5 specific subpopulations of students. So they're looking at their data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, disaggregated by the Pell eligibility status, disaggregated by age category, by sex or gender, and by GPA category. Most of these align with IPED's reporting data. And so we also provide some recommendations for institutions. Say, you might want to look at students, go back for the past 5 years and look at all students who have stopped out. And then perhaps you're looking at, if you're a community college, or looking at 2 associate's degrees, students who have earned at least 45 credits. And then disaggregate by race, by all of these different categories, to again start to use the data to just figure out which populations are being affected. And does this even align with your institutional priorities or what you think about your student population? We also ask some guiding questions for institutions to really dig into who their campus serves. So, for instance, does your campus enroll a significant number of veterans? How might that, or even students who might be currently serving in the military, so how might that impact student enrollment patterns? Is your campus located in a reentry community where there might be formerly incarcerated students who would like to enroll? Or even, does this campus operate a post-secondary education program or classes held within prison facilities? And so once students are released, would they like to attend your institution, and how does that process work? Are your students also parents or caregivers? This one we've seen so much throughout the pandemic, and we know that student parents have often had to leave post-secondary education because they have to they end up putting the needs of their family first, whether that is so that they can work to provide for their family's basic needs, whether they have to care for their children or their other family members, or whether they've had to kind of manage their children's schooling at home, and how much did that take away from their ability to also complete their education. It's a tough one to measure. I'm just going to say this because I don't think there are not very many. It's really hard to count how many parents or students. So unless this is data that your campus is collecting regularly and intentionally, there isn't kind of a big data set that's going to be able to give us how many students are parents or caregivers. And then another important point to consider is how many of your students work full-time or even part-time while they're attending school. So these considerations can help you understand, again, if you take this and then you look at your data and how and where students are stopping out, maybe you can start to look at, are there certain classes that a core group of students have not completed? And maybe you might want to look at the scheduling of those classes. And could it be that it's a scheduling conflict that doesn't work because students are working, conflicts with their ability to attend their job? So there are a lot of, I think you can start to see why this isn't an easy process, but it's so valuable for institutions and for their students. Here's an example of one of the comparison tools that we've created and how some of our institutions are starting to think about, equity issues, and they look at their data. We've hosted a series of data workshops in some of the states that we work in, and we're asking institutions to show up with their disaggregated data fill it in and we can compare to the institutional average. This is just hypothetical here. So that you can see why, where there might be groups that are over or underrepresented in that population of students with some college no degree. So again, what does that tell you about who the students are and what you might need to do to better serve them? So if you were able to, for instance, increase completion for students who fall within that universe of stopped out students, how will that change your institution's overall student body? Will your completion rates for students of color or Pell eligible students increase compared to white or non-Pell eligible students, for instance? We, through Degrees When Due, the institutions that have been participating have been submitting their, looking at their data, and we think of this process as like a funnel. So we'll start with this really large population of stopped out with some college no degree. And then they'll go through degree audits basically and determine, are there students who might have already earned a degree or credential that was not awarded? If so, can we go through the awarding process for that? And then for the rest of the group of students, the near completers, who might have financial holds on their accounts? Might there be, I'd say financial holds are some of the largest barriers that we're coming up against, but are there also academic or other non-academic barriers to completion? Is there a particular math or English course that might be the one class that students haven't completed? And then how can you use your data to advocate maybe that those changes that those barriers be removed, or to address other issues related to that barrier? So the institutions kind of continue going through this funnel and then eventually identify the students that they're able to contact, to re-engage, to invite them back to complete their credential. And some of those students re-enroll and ultimately complete. And I know that we're already starting to see some really exciting results from students in Missouri, of institutions that have identified and re-engaged students who are completing their degrees. I think this is also an important equity conversation, because we know that low income first generation and minority students are the ones that are most likely to encounter some of these barriers and to stop out before they're earning a degree. So we don't, this is all hypothetical until we actually look at our data to understand where these students are, and use that to make a change. So I wanted to share just a couple of examples of how we've started to see changes and how our institutions have been able to do this so far. So I'll share an example about identifying and removing academic barriers to completion, and then also about institutionalizing these degree reclamation processes. So in our first kind of cohort of Degrees When Due, a couple of our research sites were able to share really specific examples about identifying and removing academic barriers to completion. At one community college in California, over a third of the students they identified as near completers were missing one requirement. And that requirement was a computer literacy course. And I think in this day and age, no one would argue about the importance of computer literacy, but is taking a course the best or the only way to demonstrate that a student has computer literacy? This, institution that serves a mostly rural population, and was the sole, there are no public four-year institutions even nearby. So this was the kind of a core way to help serve adults in the region and to, hopefully help them complete their degrees, which are going to lead to better job outcomes, higher wages, upskilling, And ultimately, they were interested in looking at the public health benefits of post-secondary education. So having a third of the students they identified as within just missing one requirement would have made a really big difference in their region when it comes to post-secondary attainment. So the institution was able to take this data, bring it to the Faculty Senate, and after they went through multiple iterations and rounds of discussion, they ultimately have removed the requirement so that students are able to demonstrate computer literacy through all of the courses that they're taking, not just this one course. And they were able to award degrees to the 1/3 of the students they'd identified. Another institution in Minnesota identified that there was a health and wellness requirement. It was a similar barrier to completion. And there had long been these anecdotal stories about how this class was a class that students just weren't taking. But again, it wasn't until they looked at their data and saw that I think half of their near completers were just missing this one course. And again, health and wellness is important, but what are the other ways to support health and wellness instead of just asking students to take a class on it? This class wasn't even a part of the core curriculum. So they are in the process of changing this. COVID interrupted their plans a little bit, but they are looking at examining ways to change this requirement. And again, that's going to make a huge difference for not only the students who had stopped out, who were missing just this one course, but all of the students enrolled at that institution and students in the future who may not have to take this course and may not stop out in the future because of it. We've also seen where engagement with Degrees When Due has helped institutions adopt new processes and policies and can integrate that into their institutional work. So at both of these institutional examples I mentioned, they've changed graduation timelines to be more student friendly. They've delayed graduation application deadlines. They've increased the frequency of degree auditing to make sure that the paperwork itself doesn't create a barrier to completion for more students. And they're starting to review student transcripts and credits for multiple degrees. So now I'd like to share just a few, some of the things that I think are particularly relevant to you. And we'll talk about some of the early outcomes that we're starting to see in Missouri. And I'll share a couple of data points, some more qualitative evidence, and then also a couple of highlights from the case study that was just published. So from the institutions that have submitted data so far, they've identified over 4,000 near completers. These are students that are just within reach of a degree. 25% are students of color. So they're Black students. They identify as Black, Latinx, Asian, Asian or Pacific Islander, sorry, the 2 or more races. I wanted to put this in here, but I also struggled a little bit because that doesn't tell the whole story. I think it's what's going to be much more interesting and tell a better story is that when we're able to look at each institution's data and to talk about how those particular institutions have what students those institutions have identified and how that might change their graduation rates or their completion rates for students from these groups. I didn't want to do that because I haven't talked to the institutions first, so I didn't think it was fair of me to just throw some stuff up on a screen without having talked with them first. So that's something that we're going to work to share in the coming months and definitely at the end of the initiative. But another thing that was really kind of interesting for us to look at was that 60% of the students identified of these 4,100 students are Pell eligible students, which is our proxy for whether or not a student comes from a low income background. So again, this is going to be really exciting in what our institutions are doing or comparing their own data to their their student enrollment data and their completion data so they can really understand how graduation rates might have changed, complete an equity analysis, and really acknowledge what difference this is making in the students that that institution serves and how it's helping to further advance some of their equity goals. Some other policy and practice considerations that we've heard, and I think Sarah wrote about, that are coming out of Missouri have to do with building campus teams, improving processes, policies, and procedures, and working to address financial barriers. I'll share a couple of examples where the participants that were interviewed talk about how, a bright spot of this work is really the depth and scope of their conversations that they're able to have related to student achievement. So they've been able to facilitate a rich dialogue about retention, equity, student support, and completion. It has also brought teams, these cross-functional teams, together to rethink that maybe the way that they work together and the way that they're starting to serve these students. And it's enabled them to have these really important conversations about possible, policies that might be outdated, and to really talk through process improvements. We've heard that some of the institutions are starting to really use this data to improve, like I said, policies and processes. One institution in particular was changing the requirement of having a signed degree plan. That they said it seemed like a simple change, but it's something that literally kept students away from graduation. And they've also started to institutionalize this kind of practice of degree auditing and regularly checking to see which students could graduate but haven't, and why have they not graduated. And addressing financial barriers. At least one institution has talked about waiving graduation fees for returning students that are on probation. Other institutions are really having a conversation about institutional debt forgiveness and how that might be used as an incentive to re-enroll students. It's a little bit in the weeds with the data, but one thing that our institutions that we work with do is identify, like I said, which students have financial holds on their accounts. And so once you have that list of students with financial holds who are near completers, you can look at the amount that's owed and really think about whether there are creative ways to forgive some of that institutional debt to re-engage students. I think there's a note here too, and everyone's aware of all the federal dollars on the table, where some institutions, again, have been using their HERF funding for student debt forgiveness because the funds can be used to forgive the institutional charges that were incurred as a result of the pandemic. And then students who also incurred an institutional cost at any time, but were still enrolled during that emergency. So those are funds, federal funding, that can be used to, again, really relieve the burden on some of our students that we serve. And so I think, I wanted to share a couple of things that are coming up next, and things that we've really kind of heard and learned from the institutions that we've worked with and wanted to share. The first is that we are hosting a workshop series. It's kind of a combination of a condensed and a quick start to implementing degrees when due best practices. So we're starting in a couple of weeks. We're going to walk institutions through these really practical data mining strategies, workshop them through the equity analyses, and just really understanding who are degree eligible students, who are near completers, what are the barriers that they can easily identify, how might they be able to remove or suspend some of those barriers so that they can re-engage students, in time for the fall 2021 semester. I'm really excited also about the last workshop in this series, where we're going to work with institutions to tell their data story. So how do they take everything that they have learned through working with their data? How can they visualize that? And how do you use that to communicate with leaders at your institution? And the next is our degree mining tool that's about to be launched next week. One thing that we have learned and we have heard, and it's even mentioned in the case study, is that just the data management and technology can be a burden at the institutional level. And so we took all of these homegrown strategies and best practices and put them into a tool that will help institutions understand how to implement better data management practices, or how to use some kind of simple tools that they might already have available to be more efficient and proactive with their degree mining strategies. So this will be launched next week, and we'll be probably sharing that out on social media when it comes out. It's free. It's going to be on our website, available for anyone to click a button and start exploring. And then last, I think Sarah has alluded to this, but we're really excited to be able to share our final outcomes at the end of the year. And we'll also be launching a playbook, which we're going to make available, which shares our best practices and implementation steps for other institutions who want to continue this work. I think, one thing that we've really seen, and I think you might see kind of evidenced here, is that this type of work takes time. It does take a lot of kind of institutional investment and willingness to look under the hood and what might be a little bit messy, and to really examine your data and understand what that's telling you about your institutions and about your students. And we know that change takes time. And in order to make it, if we want to make these changes stick, it might take even longer. So we want to be able to support that. And while some of the kind of numbers and outcomes that we might see at institutions in the interim might seem small, they're using these to really make these longer term lasting changes that are going to support students in the future and ultimately kind of stop some of these students from stopping out in the first place, which is, I think, why we are all doing this work. So I am sure I'm more than happy to answer questions, but if you want to know anything else about kind of degrees when due, you can send us an email. My contact information is here, or just check out our website, degreeswhendue.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Leanne. We do have a few questions, and if you have any additional questions, please share them in the chat. Ivy Love shared, thanks so much for this presentation. How are institutions adapting their re-engagement strategies during COVID? What worked before that isn't working in the wake of the pandemic? Or conversely, what new strategies seem to be happening now? And that question is in the chat in case you need to look at it.
Ivy, thanks for that. That's a great question. And I actually, when I share the slides out afterward, I'll share kind of we've got one that has 5 best practices that we've learned for communicating with students. People's time is divided right now. So one important thing is to be persistent, and to use multiple channels to get the message out. Because sometimes it takes 3 or 4 times for that message to really get through and resonate with the student. Other things that are even more important right now: personalize the message. So the more that you can do to tell a student how close they are to completion, or what specific next steps they need to take to re-enroll, you're cutting out the guesswork for them and making it so much easier. Another strategy that I think has stuck pre-pandemic and now is to when you talk with students, let them know how the institution has changed. there's a reason why they left. So they may not have told you exactly why they left. They may have sugarcoated that a little bit, but they left for a reason. So tell them what you're doing differently now. Another example, and I can follow up and share a link to this recording. We hosted a webinar last month with some of our partners in Michigan who were able to just had an overwhelming response to a couple of their re-engagement efforts, whether that's kind of funding from the state or their Future for Frontliners program in Michigan, or their Michigan Reconnect. And because they were able to get that message out just widely across the state, they had students that were just calling up institutions. And so these are students that the institution might have contacted before that kind of ignored the message, but now that there's funding, and they're like, oh, we might not have to, pay for this. There's an opportunity. I want to go back and reskill. That's really helped them to see this big enrollment change. So whatever you can do to leverage funding or opportunities that might be created through some of this post-pandemic relief funding, use that.
All right, we have a lot of community organizations on our call today. So my question is, how can community partners engage with the institutions on this work? And then do you have any examples from other Degrees When Due states or institutions that you've seen where there's a community partnership with the institution to help stopped out students and adult students?
There's so many great examples, and I'm just going to give a shout out. I don't know if they're on the call, but St. Louis Graduates, I think is a great example of a community partner that's really working within their region they have a very clear mission and group of students that they're trying to serve, and they're doing that work with the institutions they partner with. So side note, we'll be releasing a guidebook for our Talent Hub's work in the next month or so that features interviews and best practices that we've learned about how they're using data in their efforts to identify and engage with students. I think other places that are doing this really well, New Jersey comes to mind, just because all of their community colleges are working together. They've got a very clear connection to 4 high demand career fields that they're working with their institutions to kind of put students on the pathways to complete credentials within those 4 fields. And then they're partnering also with community organizations that are able to help provide wraparound services or benefits to students. So whether those are, their students might be, working, they might be having housing issues, they might be having food insecurity issues, any way that you can work with those community organizations to help students apply for benefits and to use those benefits. Likewise, if there are community organizations that are working with adults to help them through, again, either navigating job transition, navigating kind of housing and food insecurity type questions, how can you ask questions to figure out which of those students might have started college and need to go back, and then partner with your regional institutions and to create a pathway for them.
Great, that's a great idea. Does anyone else have any questions for Leanne? We did have a note from Missouri Scholarship and Loan Foundation. They have a finish line degree completion grant program that provides funding to cover back balances of students returning to complete their degree. So that's another option for students. And Taylor Grimm has put that link in the chat if you're interested in learning more about that as well.
So if for that, can I share too? Sorry, we've got a We have another webinar coming up in July and in mid-July that's going to be focused on debt forgiveness. It's normally something that we would just be opening to our Degrees When Due community, but we're going to open that to the public. So we'll be sure to share that link, that registration link when it's available. And we're going to share some best practices for implementing institutional debt forgiveness programs, how to work with other partners in your community and these types of programs, and to give some maybe best practices or strategies for, again, using the federal dollars that might be available.
Great. And yes, this presentation, there was a question, will the presentation be available? And yes, this will be available on the DHEWD website, probably by next week on under our equity page. So, well, if there are no other questions, Leanne, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so thrilled that you're with us, and we've really been proud of the work that we've done. I guess I could give a quick question. There are some Degrees When Due institutions on the call. Is anyone like to say anything or share anything? Oh, we have some Missouri Scholarship and Loan Foundation contact info. Olivia, would you like to share something?
Sure. My name's Olivia, and I'm with University of Missouri St. Louis, and we have been engaging in Degrees When Due process for, a little bit here. We had some great wins in the fall and a couple more in the spring. But the joy that you can bring to a student by saying, hey, by the way, did you know we've been able to make some adjustments, and you're able to graduate. You don't need to do anything. You just need to reply to this email and say, yes, please count me in. It's life-changing. So we've been able to do some things. We're just like, we have a grade modification process that isn't automatic. And so students, their GPA was too low, but if I modified their grades, they were fine. And they just didn't know what to ask, and we didn't offer. And so now we're offering. So anyway, it's been fantastic. And it's just, we talk about it as part of our Bringers of Joy campaign. So anything we can do to bring joy to other people, particularly in these COVID times, has been really helpful.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. I love the bringers of joy framing too. And again, I think, Olivia, thanks for sharing that too, because we do get hung up on, right, big numbers and big goals. And it's easy to sometimes lose sight of the fact that each one of these numbers is a student. They're a person, and everything we can do to help just that one person, that's a life that can be changed for the better. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of the work that you're doing for students, all of you on this call.
Yeah, I just wanted to say at Northwest, I'm the registrar at Northwest, and I can agree with Olivia that these are some of these are the best phone calls I've ever had, because they have been so happy and so grateful. And, it came about because we looked at our policies. And so it gives us a platform to look at current policy for our current students too. And that has been extremely valuable. So I feel like the whole thing has been an excellent place to start and to convince others that, this is important. And are those policies, can they be adjusted? How important are they? So it's been helpful in that conversation. So thanks for bringing that to the state. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that point about the platform to have the conversations, that importance can't be underscored. We just had a workshop with a number of institutions in Arkansas, and just to create the space for them to say, well, actually, we're realizing that, this group of students when we're looking at our data, we're understanding that we might need to do some more work with our co-recs and how we train our advisors on co-recs. And we just, now that we sit and think about it, we haven't done that. It's been almost, over 5 years since we've had this kind of in-depth training and been able to talk about our co-recs. So we need to do that because that's something that we can do to better serve students. Again, those aren't the things that always show up immediately in the numbers, but they're the things that have lasting impact for the institutions. Great. Well, Sarah, I am happy to answer any questions if anyone wants to send me an email. They can easily reach me and I'll definitely make sure that I'll share this. You have the presentation, but I'll share the slides too. Like I said, I have a couple of bonus slides that I'll throw in when I share that just include the best practices in communicating with students and what we've started to learn from some of our focus groups about kind of why students are leaving and why students are re-enrolling.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And from all of us in Missouri, we are so appreciative of you selecting our state to do this work. It's been a great opportunity for us and all of our institutions to really look at this population and figure out how we can serve them better. So we really appreciate the opportunity and all of the work, and we look forward to continuing to look at these things and hopefully broaden out even more. So thank you so much for joining us today.